Are you looking for an in-depth conceptual analysis of omnipotence? Because if so, boy, are you in the right place. You see, the general idea of omnipotence can be found all throughout the Old and New Testament. God is called Almighty. We're told that there is nothing too hard for God, and that nothing will be impossible with God. However, how these verses should be understood has been a complicated and ongoing discussion. One way of understanding omnipotence has been what might be called an act omnipotence approach, which understands omnipotence in terms of what acts God can perform. So a simple form of act omnipotence might be something like, P is omnipotent if for any X, P can do X. In this definition, X can represent any task or act that one might want to fill in. However, this definition is likely untenable. While theologians have long debated how omnipotence is to be understood, there has been substantial agreement that there are some acts that an omnipotent being cannot perform. For instance, a logically impossible task, such as creating a square circle, cannot be performed by any being. But virtually everybody recognizes that this should not count against a being having omnipotence. Similarly, it's generally recognized that God cannot perform any morally wronged act because of his essential moral goodness. Because there are some tasks that God cannot perform, various attempts to modify act omnipotence have been proposed. One might be tempted to modify our above definition to something like, P is omnipotent if for any logically possible X, P can do X. However, it seems that this is also problematic because there are logically possible acts that an omnipotent being can't do. For instance, an omnipotent being cannot create a statue that was made by a non-omnipotent person, but this task is logically possible to perform. I can do it, and so can you. One might be tempted to modify the definition again to something like, P is omnipotent if for any X, which it is logically possible for P to perform, P can perform X. However, this also doesn't work, because if we restrict what is required of omnipotence to the agent in question, it turns out that a man who necessarily only has the ability to scratch his left ear meets the criteria for omnipotence. Because of these issues and more, act omnipotence has been rejected, and many philosophers have instead endorsed what might be called a states of affairs omnipotence. Now, states of affairs omnipotence articulates omnipotence not based on what acts can be performed, but whether the being in question can actualize certain states of affairs. For instance, a states of affairs proponent might say something like, P is omnipotent if for any logically possible state of affairs X, P can bring about X. However, as it turns out, this is also too permissive and would need modification. There are some logically possible states of affairs that God can't bring about. For instance, it's logically possible that every person on earth right now freely chooses to raise their right hand. However, God can't bring about this situation without presenting issues with this action being freely chosen. As a result of this, one might suggest a more rigorous modification, such as S is omnipotent at time t if and only if S can at t actualize any state of affairs that is not described by counterfactuals about the free acts of others, and that is broadly logically possible for someone to actualize, given the same hard pass at t and the same true counterfactuals about free acts of others. Just as with act omnipotence, states of affairs omnipotence seems to be getting more complicated the longer we think about it. However, due to the complications just discussed surrounding states of affairs omnipotence, there are some who have suggested an entirely different approach, which we might refer to as powers omnipotence. Now, powers omnipotence seeks to articulate omnipotence not in terms of acts or what states of affairs can be brought about, but in terms of the powers of the agent. For instance, Eric Wielenberg provides a simple definition of X is omnipotent if and only if it is not the case that there is some state of affairs, P, such that X is unable to bring about P because of a lack of power in X. So to illustrate this concept, Wielenberg offers the following thought experiment. Wielenberg says, quote, imagine a very strong man. Imagine that he is the strongest possible person. Necessarily, no one is stronger than he is. Let's call him Hercules. Perhaps we doubt that Hercules is in fact the strongest possible person. We want to test his strength. How might we go about this? Well, one obvious test of strength is lifting ability. We ask Hercules to lift a 100-pound stone. He lifts it easily. Next, we ask him to lift a 1,000-pound stone. He does so. Similarly, for 10,000 pounds, 100,000 pounds, Hercules even lifts a 1,000,000-pound stone. So far, we have failed to prove that Hercules is not the strongest possible person. But now imagine that we take a 10-pound stone and we coat it with a substance that renders it incredibly slippery. It is so slippery that no one can get a grip on it. Now we ask Hercules to lift this 10-pound stone. Hercules cannot grip the stone and so cannot lift it. Aha, we declare triumphantly, Hercules, you are a liar. You said that you were the strongest possible person, yet you cannot lift this 10-pound stone. This proves that you are not the strongest possible person. But of course, we have not proven that Hercules is not the strongest possible person. We know that Hercules is strong enough to lift the slippery stone. We have just seen him lift much heavier stones. It is not a lack of strength that prevents Hercules from lifting the stone. It is the slipperiness of the stone. Imagine that we have somehow acquired a 10-pound stone that is essentially slippery. It is so slippery that no human can grip it, and so no human can lift it. Let's assume that Hercules is essentially human. It follows that there is no possible world in which Hercules lifts this stone. Yet it seems clear that Hercules is strong enough to lift the stone, even though it is metaphysically impossible that he do so. Just as Hercules, end quote, just as Hercules' inability to lift the slippery stone is not because of his lack of strength, God's inability to bring about certain states of affairs is not because of his lack of power. God's inability to perform a morally wrong act is not due to a lack of power. It's because of the presence of his goodness. Now, in a similar vein to this, T.J. Mawson has defined omnipotence as that of having the most power-granting set of abilities that it is logically possible anyone might have. Mawson argues that not all abilities are powers, as some abilities are in fact liabilities. God does not have the ability to lie or make unreasonable decisions, but these abilities are not powers, they are liabilities. They make the agent worse for having them. So God's inability to perform these tasks, therefore, is not due to a lack of power, and it therefore does not count against his omnipotence. So, yep, that's a very brief intro into omnipotence. I hope you enjoyed it.